Well, guess what? The West hands in Ukraine are as bloody as Putin's. What? You're not allowed to say that. The View will want you investigated and arrested. This is from Jonathan Cook over at MintPress News. Ukrainians will pay the price to wear down Russia, just as Syrians, Libyans, Iranians, Yemenis, Venezuelans, and Palestinians have paid the price as the United States has sought to attain the goals of its globe-spanning imperial project. So there is a discursive nervous tick all over social media at the moment, including from prominent journalists such as Guardian columnist George Monbiot. The demand is that everyone not only condemn Russian President Vladimir Putin for invading Ukraine, but to do so without qualification.
Whataboutery?
Yeah. Here it is. George Monbiot, Guardian columnist. And this is what he says. Any reluctance to submit is considered certain proof that the person is a Putin apologist or a Kremlin bot, and that their views on everything under the sun, especially their criticisms of equivalent Western war crimes, can be safely ignored. And here's George Monbiot. For years, I've been arguing with a faction within the anti-imperialist left that is neither anti-imperialist nor distinguishable in its foreign policy positions from the far right. It is pro-Putin. It recycles Kremlin propaganda and whitewashes atrocities. Holy shit.
This dude's a classic dickhead, by the way. He's got a bunch of great numbers, George Monbiot.
How convenient for all these Western leaders who have committed war crimes at least as bad as Russia's current ones. How convenient. I have repeatedly described Russia's invasion as illegal. I have regularly called Putin a war criminal. And I have consistently compared Putin's deeds to the very worst actions taken by the West over the past 2 decades. But none of that is enough. More is always needed. You're never quite loyal enough to your country. You've never proven it yet. You're not pure enough in your loyalty.
Yeah, don't you want to be on the lesser of two evils side of history?
The demand for unequivocal denunciation is a strange, if common one, and suggests that those insisting on it are being dishonest, if only with themselves. The function of the demand is not to clarify whether any particular piece of information or an argument is credible. It is intended purely as a gotcha meme. I don't remember an instance that anyone condemned Tony Blair or George W. Bush for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 before they could be heard or taken seriously, or that they denounced the U.S.-backed overthrow of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi that plunged the country into murderous chaos.
I remember you had to pledge loyalty to George Bush and Tony Blair, or else you couldn't. I remember that.
Or that they deplore the West's material support of Saudi Arabia's slaughter of Yemen's population, including Britain's sale on planes, bombs, and training to Riyadh. Or that they criticize the West's backing of head-chopping jihadists in Syria, who coincidentally now appear to be drifting into Ukraine to become our allies again. Or that they decry decades of Western support for Israel as it has disappeared the Palestinian people. Just to remind you, Britain is still today supplying bombs, missiles, aircraft, operational support, training, and special services to Saudi Arabia to continue years of mass murder of civilians in Yemen. Every crime we deplore in Ukraine, we enable in Yemen. And those are the things for which we, meaning Westerners, are directly responsible. We elected the politicians who caused this unquantifiable suffering. Those bombs were ours. We ought to be clamoring for our leaders to be dragged to The Hague to be tried for war crimes. By contrast, we, meaning Westerners, are not responsible for Putin or his actions. I cannot vote him out of office. Nothing I say will make him alter course. And worse, anything I do say against him or Russia simply amplifies the mindless chorus of self-righteous Western commentary intended to cast stones at Russia's warmongers while leaving our own homegrown warmongers in place. Westerners denouncing Putin won't make compromise and peace more likely. It will make it less likely. Russians need to be highlighting Putin's crimes as best they can to drive him to the negotiating table, while we need to be doing the same to our leaders to push them to the same table. As long as our attention is on Putin and his crimes, it is not on our leaders and their crimes. Those who insist it is quite possible to denounce both Putin and Western leaders at the same time are precisely the people who have been so half-hearted in holding our own leaders to account. Monbiot, let us note, has not used a single one of his weekly columns at The Guardian to highlight the years-long plight of Julian Assange, locked away in a British dungeon for revealing US and UK war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is the gravest attack on a free press in living memory, and yet Monbiot used his most recent column to attack Julian Assange supporters, like veteran journalist John Pilger, for not being voluble enough in denouncing Putin. What really is the point of demanding Westerners denounce Putin unequivocally when the entire Western media and political class is directing our gaze exclusively at Russia's crimes precisely so Westerners don't look at equivalent Western crimes? The truth is that in power politics, unequivocal denunciations are for politicians and diplomats and virtue signalers. Condemnations may be emotionally satisfying, but the rest of us can put our energies to far better use. For most of us, the better course would be to blow away the immediate fog of war and instead analyze our, meaning the West's, role in the unfolding events. Even a cursory glance shows that the West's hands are not clean in Ukraine, not at all. The meddling and hypocrisy have occurred in two stages, first from politicians and then from the media. It was the choices made by Western politicians that provoked the invasion, and Russian troops are in Ukraine not because Putin is Hitler, mad, or a megalomaniac, though again the invasion makes him a war criminal in the same mold as Tony Blair and George W. Bush. Russian troops are there because he and his officials judge the West to be acting malevolently and in bad faith in their dealings with the Ukraine. The Putin as madman or Hitler script deflects attention away from the very obvious fact that Western leaders willfully played fast and loose with the security of Ukraine and the safety of its population. The West encouraged Ukrainians to believe that they would soon fall under NATO's security umbrella, when in fact the West had no intention of protecting them and is not now only too evident. Ukrainians were led to believe that the more Russia's posture turned belligerent towards Ukraine, the more likely NATO would be to come to Ukraine's rescue and act as its savior, which of course incentivized the Ukrainian government to keep poking the Russian bear in the expectation that Kiev would have a NATO insurance policy up its sleeve. It didn't, it never did, and current events show. On the back of NATO's deception, recent Ukrainian leaders confidently fomented ethnic nationalism at home and thereby themselves played a dangerous game of chicken with their superpower neighbor. That included coddling anti-Russian fascists at home and stoking a related civil war in the Donbass region by its ultra-nationalist allies against the Russian ethnic community living there as a way to drag NATO directly into the conflict. So what they're saying is that Ukraine kept shelling those Russians in the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass, so that the NATO would get dragged into this conflict. And that's his. So here's Salon.com, and this is from, there's no fucking date on it.
March 10th, 2022.
Right
that? After Nicholas J.
here
Davies.
it is, March 10th. It says, are there really neo-Nazis fighting for Ukraine? Well, yes, but it's a long story.
It takes two people to write it. And I'll bet it's not that long an article. But it's really
no, Putin didn't wage war to denazify Ukraine, but that nation's shadowy far-right militias are big trouble. Rokana says, ever since the Orange Revolution began under President Bush, the U.S. has been complicit in the rehabilitation and spread of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Enough is enough. Our government must stand up against the Azov Battalion and other fascist groups. That's what he was saying before, but now he says arm the Nazis. No, Rokana did a complete flip-flop. So back to the MintPress. President Zelensky hasn't abandoned his pre-invasion intransigence. He has entrenched, calling for Ukraine to be armed with nuclear missiles and for NATO to either impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine or give Ukraine the planes to enforce such a zone itself. That Zelensky wants NATO to bail him out, especially after NATO was responsible for enticing him into a current confrontation with Russia, is hardly surprising. But the degree to which the Western media have pushed Zelensky's line means a strong majority of the U.S. public now favor Kiev's course of action, even though it would likely trigger World War III between nuclear powers. So, no-fly zone over Ukraine. 59% of people support it. But if we told people that a no-fly over Ukraine would actually cause a war with Russia and us, then only 38% of the people support it. So it goes down about 20%.
That's good. So it's right there at 59%. It's about at where Democrats who want to have concentration camps for
the
unvaccinated
unvaccinated.
numbers.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it goes down to below concentration camp numbers.
How enthrall Westerners are to this media-confected suicidal narrative can be gauged by the number of armchair warriors in the West accusing anyone, taking a more cautious approach of not only being Putin apologists, but of denying the Ukrainian people their sovereign right to join NATO and fall under its protection. But NATO membership isn't a sovereign right, and it shouldn't be viewed as some kind of glorified neighborhood watch scheme. NATO is a military club. States qualified to join if the other members agree that they want to commit to protecting that state. If NATO members don't have the ability or will to defend another state, as is the case with Ukraine, then it's a crime to pretend that they do, for the very reason the events unfolding now demonstrate. In fact, it is not just an ordinary crime, it's a crime against humanity. Every death in the current war, Ukrainian and Russian, could almost certainly have been averted had the U.S. and its NATO allies not led Ukraine up the garden path. Had Ukrainians not believed that with enough pressure they could force NATO's hand in their favor, they would have had to accommodate Russian concerns well before the invasion, such as by committing to neutrality. So, again, what this story is telling you is what we've been telling you since the start of this, is that the United States has been wanting to provoke a reaction like this from Russia. And they're using the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder to do it, and they don't give a shit about them. And so
Didn't we
that's
do that with Georgia also.
Yes. So what we should be doing is telling Ukraine to remain neutral. Don't join NATO or join Russia. Stay neutral. That's what Russia wants too. Russia would have had no grounds or pretext, depending on how you wish to look at it, to invade Ukraine. The media's madman and Hitler scripts are needed now to turn reality on its head, suggesting that Putin would have invaded whatever actions NATO or Ukraine took. But if that is not true, and there is no evidence it is, then the blood of the victims of this war is most certainly on the West's hands, just as it is in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Gaza, Yemen, and elsewhere. The second hypocrisy is the current one being peddled in the Western media. They want to flaunt a bogus moral concern about the suffering of Ukrainians under attack from Russia that they never show towards the victims of Western bombs and missiles. So the victims in Ukraine are so worthy. That's what Chomsky called worthy victims. So the victims of our enemies are worthy victims. The victims of the United States, they're unworthy victims. So they never get shown on the news. Terrible as the suffering of Ukrainians is, 2 weeks into the invasion, it is still a pale shadow of the decades of suffering of Palestinians in Gaza or of Yemenis under Saudi planes and bombs supplied by the West. The prioritization of one over the other needs splaining.
I think they did explain it. They said, but this is Europe.
Yes.
I heard that over and over.
John McCovey says The Guardian has published more stories about Ukraine just today than it has published about Yemen in all of 2022. Social media warriors, much less sophisticated than the corporate media, readily rationalize this lack of interest in the West victims by dismissing them as terrorists or blaming them for living under terrorist regimes. or by simply insisting that they are further removed from us, as the Britons and Americans somehow feel more of a natural affinity with Ukrainians than with Syrians or Palestinians or with Russians. We don't unless the corporate media keeps insisting such a bond exists. If that strategy fails, it is on to the next one, arguing that any effort to point out the utter hypocrisy of the Western media and its entirely hollow concern for Ukrainians, rather than for Ukraine as a pawn of the West colonial chessboard, is so-called whataboutery. So if you mention any of the shit that he's mentioning or any of the shit we talk about, they go, oh, that's all whataboutery. Like when I say the United States is now occupying a third of Syria, the oil fields, they go, that's whataboutery. That's not whataboutery. That's showing that we have completely double standards on the world stage. And so you can't have Tony Soprano writing parking tickets. It breeds contempt for the law.
By the way, you can buy a really nice carved colonial chessboard at the Whataboutery. The
Whataboutery
catalog.
I love the Whataboutery catalog. It's bad enough that such reasoning is rooted in a profound racism that counts white Europeans as worthy victims and brown and black victims as collateral damage of supposed Western peacemaking. But actually, the rot runs far deeper. It is not just racism at work in the special treatment of Ukraine's suffering over that of Iraqis, Yemenis, or Palestinians. That could be solved through education and awareness raising. No, the Western media's identification with Ukraine, and consequently the public's identification with its plight, is based on Ukraine's usefulness to the Western imperial project, which is exactly what got us in this mess in the first place. Washington planners see the world largely in terms of high-stakes version of the children's party game musical chairs. As the chairs disappear, it is ever more important to make sure you, rather than your enemies, grab at the last seats. That has required the U.S. and its allies to ever more aggressively isolate Russia and China, trying to sow divisions and make each feel threatened and isolated, which, as Moscow and Beijing more clearly understand Washington's strategy, has driven these two unlikely partners into each other's arms, China and Russia.
They go back. Did you ever see when Khrushchev wrote about visiting Chairman Mao, and Chairman Mao knew Khrushchev couldn't swim, so he wanted to meet in a pool?
Really? No.
Mao swam around, and Khrushchev had swimmies, or he had like a little float he had to sit in.
In Ukraine, meanwhile, the United States and its NATO allies appear to be doing what they can to drag out the war for as long as fucking possible. Russia appeared initially to want a relatively short war of attrition to pacify Ukraine, forcing its nationalist government to drop aspirations to become a launch pad for NATO weapons and impose on it instead neutrality. Of course, the conclusion even Westerners would draw, if we weren't so propagandized by the media, is that neutrality for Ukraine is inevitable, unless we are willing to risk the alternative of World War III. Any delay in achieving neutrality for Ukraine as an outcome simply causes unnecessary death and suffering. The U.S., by contrast, wants a long proxy war of attrition, covertly supplying Ukrainian forces, indifferent as to whether they are nice ones or neo-Nazis, to bog down Russia in years of difficult guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency. The bloodshed will feed the hostility and unthinking racism of Western publics towards Russia and Russians, providing the pretext for Washington to sustain the West's parallel economic war on Russia. Ukrainians will pay the price as the U.S. seeks to wear down Russia, just as Syrians, Libyans, Iranians, Yemenis, Venezuelans, and Palestinians have paid the price as the United States has sought to attain the goals of its global spanning imperial project. Washington understands that a weakened Russia might not have been able to save Bashar Assad's government from the takeover of Syria by the West Islamic State and al-Qaeda allies there, and in the future it is hoped Moscow will be in no position to support others who resist Western hegemony, especially the pariah states of Venezuela, Iran, and China. So we're trying to get Russia bogged down in a war in Ukraine like we got bogged down in Afghanistan, as the hopes that Russia will be too caught up in the Ukraine war to go fuck with us when we try to do Venezuela or Syria or any of the other shit.
What are they going to interfere with? Our blowjob of the Venezuelans for some oil?
For some oil now?
They're going to cockblock it?
So the West definitely has its blood on its hands. So the West definitely has blood on its hands in the West. I'm in Ukraine, all over the globe. But no one will talk about it in the news. And that was a great article by MintPress. So now you know. I mean, you've known this, but it all bears repeating.
We should have O.J. Simpson talk about the murder of the murderous Vladimir Putin, and then when you go, well, what about? He goes, that's whataboutery. O.J. still, I've had it with your whataboutery.
We're doing our live stand-up tour. We're going to Houston. We're going to Dallas. We're going to Los Angeles, Orlando, Tampa, Columbus, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Des Moines, Omaha, Kansas City, and more. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all the tickets and become a premium member. You get all our bonus stuff.